When I saw my husband open the front door with his father following behind, carrying a box of wine, I felt something shift in my chest, not because of the wine, not even because of the surprise visit. It was the way they laughed together. The way his father's eyes flicked to me, then lingered a second longer than they should have. It wasn't a look full of hunger or intent. It was worse, gentle recognition, a kind of quiet seeing I hadn't felt in years. That small, deliberate pause said more than any words could have. My husband didn't notice, of course. He was already in the kitchen, talking loudly about the new barbecue he bought. But I stood in the hallway, frozen for a moment too long. My fingers curled into the fabric of my dress as I watched his father set the wine down, glance at me again, and smile. It was the kind of smile you give someone when you know they're not okay but you won't ask. That smile became a stone in my chest, and it never left. Maybe you think this is a story about a quick mistake, a rush of feelings, a fling sparked by boredom. But it's not. It's about something deeper, something slower, something that crept up through the cracks of a quiet life. If you're watching this, tell me, have you ever wanted to scream in a room full of people, but smiled instead? Let me tell you what happened, and why I'll never look at that smile the same way again. Before I reveal the secret I kept for far too long, write in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me, have you ever felt truly seen by the one person you weren't supposed to notice? It was a Sunday, and the kitchen smelled like roast chicken and thyme. The smell always made me feel safe, like a memory from someone else's childhood. My husband was fussing over the oven, adjusting the temperature as if he hadn't already checked it 3 times. I stood beside him, nodding at his commentary, letting his words pass through me like radio static. His father would be arriving any minute, and I had just barely finished setting the table. White plates, folded napkins, those glasses we only used for guests. I wiped my hands on my apron and caught a glimpse of myself in the reflective oven door. My hair was pulled back, no makeup, the same loose blouse I'd worn last weekend. Serviceable. Fine. The doorbell rang, and my husband shouted, "He's here," like we hadn't known. I moved to greet him, polite, prepared. He stepped in with that familiar calmness, shoulders relaxed, eyes scanning gently. He was aging gracefully, silver hair swept back, linen shirt, slight tan from working in the yard, or maybe just existing more fully in the sunlight than I ever did. He hugged me briefly, the way in-laws do, but something in that touch stayed. Not physical. Just present. He looked at me, not past me. His eyes didn't slide off me like my husband's often did when distracted. Instead, they paused. I offered coffee. He declined. Said wine was fine. I poured. The bottle made that soft glugging sound as it tilted, and for the first time in weeks, my hands didn't tremble from caffeine. Dinner was loud. My husband talked over everyone, like he always did when he was excited. He went on about a new project at work, a camping trip he wanted to plan, a neighbor's dog that barked too much. His father nodded along, offered the occasional joke, but mostly listened. He watched. He watched me, and not inappropriately, but intently. As though cataloging every time I smiled without joy, every time my gaze drifted off toward the window. At one point, while clearing the plates, I dropped a fork. It clattered on the floor. Reflexively, I bent to pick it up, and so did he. Our fingers met, and that moment, just that moment, lasted too long. He looked at me. I looked back. We both stood quickly, murmured sorry, and stepped apart. My husband didn't notice. He was in the living room by then, turning up the volume on the TV. Later, after dessert, they both sat on the back patio with drinks. I stayed inside under the excuse of cleaning up, but really, I needed space. The house felt heavy. I washed dishes slowly, letting the water run longer than necessary. My hands moved automatically, but my mind was elsewhere. Through the kitchen window, I could see them, my husband gesturing animatedly, his father just nodding, sipping. Occasionally, he'd glance toward the house, and I'd turn away, pretending not to notice. But I noticed. Every time. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay beside my husband, staring at the ceiling fan spinning shadows. His breathing was steady. He always slept easy. I didn't. My body felt like it was holding something it couldn't name. I thought about how his father listened. How he looked at me like I mattered. Not because he wanted something. Not because he was trying to fix anything. Just because I was there, and that was enough. Monday came like fog. I moved through the house mechanically, laundry, dishes, emails. He stayed another night. I hadn't realized. My husband casually mentioned it while scrolling his phone. He's tired. I told him to crash in the guest room. That evening, I made tea for everyone. My husband was in his office on a call. His father sat at the table, flipping through the newspaper. I brought over the mugs, and as I placed his in front of him, he said quietly, "You seem distant lately." I froze. "I'm fine." He tilted his head. "You don't have to say that to me." Silence stretched between us like wire pulled tight. I forced a smile, nodded, and walked away. My hands were shaking again, but not from caffeine this time. That night, I dreamt I was in a room full of people who spoke in another language, and only one person understood me. But when I turned to speak to him, he vanished. I woke up with my pillow damp, not knowing if it was sweat or tears. The next morning, he left. Early. Before I woke. The guest room was tidy. The bed made. No trace. Only his teacup still sat on the table, empty. That day, I stared at it longer than I cared to admit. I tried to shake it. Convince myself it was nothing. But it wasn't. It was the start of something that would unravel everything. And I didn't even know it yet. The morning after he left, I walked into the kitchen and found his cup still sitting on the table, exactly where he'd placed it. Cold tea stained the bottom in a pale ring. I don't know why I didn't clear it immediately. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe part of me believed that if I left it there long enough, he might come back, pick it up, and sit down again like nothing had changed. But something had changed. Not between us, exactly, but inside me. The silence he left behind was different than the one I'd been living with for years. It had a weight to it. A clarity. I went through the rest of the day trying to fold myself back into routine. Laundry. Emails. A trip to the store. Nothing extraordinary. But everywhere I went, I saw shadows of him. The way he leaned when he listened. The way his voice softened when he said my name. The way he looked at me like he actually wanted to hear what I had to say, not just wait for his turn to speak. By late afternoon, I was restless. I kept walking into rooms and forgetting why. I tried reading. I stared at the same paragraph for 15 minutes and absorbed none of it. The day stretched endlessly, like fabric pulled too tight. When the sun began to lower in the sky, painting gold along the kitchen counter, I finally let myself stop pretending. I poured myself a glass of wine, only one, and sat outside in the backyard. The air was warmer than it should have been for spring. The neighbor's dog barked occasionally. A lawnmower buzzed somewhere down the street. Ordinary sounds. Comforting, maybe. But I didn't feel comfort. I felt alert, as if my body was anticipating something without my permission. I thought about that moment, his fingers brushing mine, the quiet tension, the way he'd said, "You don't have to say that to me." It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't a move. It was worse. It was recognition. That night, after my husband came home from work, he talked through dinner about a new proposal he'd been working on. He didn't ask how my day was. I nodded when appropriate, made the right sounds. He didn't notice when I reached for the salt twice, or that I hadn't touched my glass. When I cleared the plates, he kissed me absently on the cheek and said he'd be in the den if I wanted to join him. I said I might. I didn't. Instead, I stood at the sink, washing dishes with more force than necessary. The water was too hot. My hands turned red under it, but I didn't move. I thought about how different it felt to be touched absent-mindedly compared to being seen with intention. My marriage hadn't been full of fights. There were no betrayals, no screaming matches. That would have been easier to define. Instead, it was a slow erosion. Smiles given out of habit, not feeling. Physical closeness without warmth. A kind of polite partnership that looked fine from the outside. But inside? I was crumbling in places no one could see. The next weekend, we hosted another dinner. This time it was a larger gathering, my husband's sister, her boyfriend, a few neighbors. Laughter filled the house again, and I played my role flawlessly. Dressed nicely, smiled often, kept the drinks flowing, the food hot. I floated through the evening like a well-trained hostess, but underneath, I was scanning every face that came through the door, waiting. Hoping. And then he arrived. He came in quietly, like always. No fanfare. A nod to everyone, a few words. But when our eyes met, the noise around us fell away for a fraction of a second. It wasn't dramatic. No sparks. Just silence. A pause. A breath. And then it passed. He turned to greet someone else. I turned to check the oven. Throughout the evening, I avoided him. On purpose. I talked more to the guests, laughed a little louder than usual. I was performing stability, hoping he wouldn't see through it. But I knew he did. I felt his gaze a few times. Not invasive, just present. After dessert, I was gathering plates when he appeared beside me in the kitchen. I hadn't heard him enter. He reached for a glass at the same moment I did. Our hands met. A pause. We kissed. Nothing else. No words. No movement beyond that. Just the press of lips, brief, inevitable. And then we both stepped back. I think we both realized, in that instant, that we had crossed into something that couldn't be undone. I carried the plates back out. He returned to the patio. My heart didn't stop racing for the rest of the night. I smiled when someone told a joke. I nodded when someone mentioned the weather. But inside, something seismic had shifted. When the evening ended and people began leaving, he was among the last to go. As he stood in the hallway putting on his coat, my husband called out from the living room, thanking him for the wine. He called back something polite. But before he opened the door, he looked at me one more time. Not asking. Not apologizing. Just looking. That night, I lay awake again, replaying it. The quiet moment in the kitchen. The way his breath had caught right before. The softness of it. The wrongness of it. The truth of it. I hadn't meant for this to happen. I wasn't looking to escape or to betray. But I also hadn't realized how much I was starving until someone fed me a single bite of warmth. What haunted me wasn't the kiss. It was how natural it felt. The next morning, everything looked the same. My husband poured his coffee, kissed me on the forehead, asked about groceries. I answered on autopilot. But something was different. Not on the surface. But underneath. And I had no idea where it would lead. The morning after the dinner, the house smelled faintly of wine, lemon, and something sweet, probably the remnants of the cake I had left uncovered on the counter. I stood in the kitchen long before anyone else stirred, staring at the sunlight cutting across the tile, slicing through the quiet. My hands were curled around a mug of coffee I wasn't drinking. I just held it. It gave me something to do while my mind raced through everything that had happened the night before. That kiss, short, simple, silent, played over in my memory like a loop. There had been no urgency in it, no desperation. And maybe that was what made it worse. Or better. I wasn't sure. It hadn't felt reckless. It had felt acknowledged. Like we were both saying something we couldn't articulate otherwise. Something had passed between us in that second, and it had changed me. I told myself it wasn't going to happen again. I told myself it had been a moment, suspended outside of real life. I had a husband. A home. A marriage that wasn't broken, it just didn't pulse anymore. It didn't breathe. But guilt wasn't what consumed me that morning. It was awareness. Of myself. Of him. Of the space between us that was no longer empty. Later that day, while my husband was out running errands, I gathered laundry from the bedrooms. When I entered the guest room, I hesitated. Everything looked untouched. The pillow still fluffed. The blanket folded. The scent of cologne lingered faintly on the air. I stood there too long, holding a shirt to my chest. Then I left. I couldn't be in that room anymore. That afternoon, I went for a walk alone. I told my husband I needed fresh air, and he barely looked up from his laptop when he nodded. I walked for miles, not thinking about where I was going. Just letting my legs move. I passed houses, a park, a bench with peeling paint. I ended up at a bookstore I hadn't visited in years. Inside, the silence felt thick and comfortable. The smell of old paper soothed something in me. I wandered the aisles and ran my fingers along the spines of novels. Eventually, I picked up a book without really looking at the title. It was something about solitude. I didn't read the back. I just carried it to the register and bought it. When I got home, my husband was still at his computer. He looked up briefly, smiled, and asked if I had enjoyed my walk. I said I had. He nodded, then returned to his screen. I stood behind him for a moment, watching the way he tilted his head slightly when he concentrated. I remembered loving that about him once. We ate dinner in front of the television. A documentary about architecture. Something he liked. I barely touched my food. My thoughts were elsewhere. The following days were filled with quiet routines. Nothing out of place. Nothing suspicious. But inside me, something new had taken root. And it grew quickly. Not like ivy, curling in secret. More like a tree pushing through concrete. One evening, my husband mentioned in passing that he might need to travel for work soon. A few days in another city. Meetings, hotel, standard itinerary. I asked when. He said he wasn't sure yet. I nodded and said nothing more. But a part of me, small and hidden, began to stir with possibility. I hated myself for feeling that way. I really did. But I also couldn't deny the pulse of anticipation. Not because I had a plan. I didn't. I wouldn't. But something in me wanted to see what would happen if the room got quiet enough again. If the air got heavy enough again. 2 days later, I saw him. Not by arrangement. Not by accident either. I had gone to the local market on Saturday morning. It was something I did often: for fresh produce, a few small indulgences, a bouquet of something fragrant for the dining table. And there he was, a few stalls ahead, comparing bunches of herbs. He hadn't seen me. Not yet. I could have walked away. I should have. But instead, I stepped closer. Slowly. He turned. Our eyes met. And for a moment, we both just stood there. He gave me a quiet smile. Nothing bold. Nothing pointed. Just recognition. I nodded. Shopping for dinner? He lifted a small bag. Trying to be domestic. I gestured to the flowers in my basket. Trying to be something, too. We talked for a few minutes. About nothing and everything. Tomatoes. The weather. A new bakery near the corner. But under it all, the silence hummed. That same silence from before. The one filled with everything unspoken. When we parted, he touched my arm briefly. Just a hand on a sleeve. A gesture so light it could be mistaken for casual. But it wasn't. That night, I arranged the flowers in a vase, then sat on the sofa staring at them for a long time. The petals were white, slightly bruised at the edges. Beautiful anyway. Maybe even more so because of their imperfection. My husband came home late. He dropped his bag by the door, kissed my forehead, and asked if I'd eaten. I said yes. He didn't press. We lay in bed, facing opposite directions. I listened to the sound of his breathing, steady and deep. I used to find comfort in that. I used to match my breath to his, sinking us in sleep. But now, I felt like we were on different shores. The same tide, but separate waves. I closed my eyes and told myself again, this would not happen again. I would not let it. But the truth was, I no longer believed myself. The suitcase appeared in the hallway like it always did, dusty navy fabric, broken zipper on one side, the same fraying handle I'd tried to mend twice. I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't need to. My husband rattled off a few details: city name, hotel chain, client dinner. It was routine. We had fallen into that kind of marriage where departures didn't feel like interruptions, but extensions of the usual rhythm. We both moved around each other, doing the necessary things, checking flight times, folding shirts, making sure chargers were packed. But we didn't look at each other much. He left on a Wednesday. The house didn't feel emptier, it just felt clearer, like a fog had lifted. I didn't plan anything. I didn't dress differently. I didn't light candles or pour wine. I spent most of the day cleaning, folding linens, repotting a dying plant in the hallway. I cooked dinner for one and sat in silence, chewing too slowly and not finishing the plate. The house creaked as it always did, the pipes groaned, and outside, the streetlights flickered as dusk settled in. Around 9, I stepped out into the backyard. The evening air had cooled, the kind of temperature that required a sweater but not shoes. I walked barefoot on the patio, listening to the faint sounds of the neighborhood, distant barking, someone's television humming behind a closed window, the low hum of a passing car. I didn't expect a message. But one came. Just 4 words, blinking on my screen. Are you still up? I stared at them longer than I should have. My first instinct was to turn off my phone and pretend I hadn't seen it. But I didn't. I answered simply. Yes. A minute passed. Then another. Then. I'm walking past your street. Didn't mean to. Just happened. Another minute. Then. I can keep walking. I typed slowly. I'm on the patio. That's all. There was no answer. For a moment I thought perhaps he'd taken it as a no. Maybe that would have been better. But then I heard footsteps. Not close, not loud, just enough. A silhouette appeared between the hedges, hesitant, paused. He didn't walk toward me immediately. He stopped at the gate, as if waiting for something. I didn't move either. I just stood there, sweater wrapped tight around my arms. Eventually, I stepped forward. Quietly. I opened the gate. No words. Just the squeak of the metal hinge, the brush of his coat as he stepped inside. We didn't sit. We didn't talk about the weather, or work, or anything safe. We stood there, facing each other, under the dim bulb above the back door. The silence between us wasn't new, but it was heavier now, as if it needed to be acknowledged. I looked at him, at the small lines around his eyes, at the way he always stood slightly tilted, as if listening to something distant. He broke the silence with something small. A comment about the flowers I had planted. I answered with something smaller, a note about how they hadn't bloomed yet. We stood close, not touching, not reaching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth between us. He said, "I shouldn't have come." I nodded. "I know." And then neither of us moved. Minutes passed like hours. I heard an owl in the distance. A breeze picked up and carried the scent of the earth, slightly wet from the morning rain. I looked at the sky, not because I was interested, but because I couldn't look at him anymore without something unraveling. When he finally stepped back, it was slow, deliberate. He said he should go. I nodded again. Still no goodbyes. No plans. He left through the same gate, and I watched the shape of him disappear beyond the hedges. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the edge of my bed, watching the shadows shift on the carpet. My mind wasn't racing, it was quiet, too quiet. Like it was bracing for something. The next morning, I brewed coffee without realizing I had made enough for two. I caught myself pouring a second cup and laughed bitterly under my breath. I poured it out before it got cold. Later that afternoon, I went to the store. I needed milk, bread, maybe more out of ritual than necessity. At the checkout line, I saw a small shelf of postcards, cheap prints of local parks and faded landmarks. My hand hovered over one with a bench in the background, almost identical to the one we'd sat on once before, weeks ago, saying nothing but everything. I didn't buy it. I walked past it and left the store without looking back. The next few days blurred together. I kept the house clean, kept my routine. I answered my husband's texts, short and efficient. He asked how things were. I told him fine. He sent a photo of a seafood dish from a restaurant. I replied with a thumbs-up emoji. We played our parts. Neither of us stepped out of the roles. But something inside me had shifted. Not in a fiery, impulsive way, but slowly, steadily. Like a quiet undoing. I was no longer trying to decide if something might happen. I was trying to understand how I would live with the fact that it already had. On the fourth day, I took a drive. No destination in mind. I turned where the roads felt calm. I ended up at a small lake just outside the city, the kind of place people fished on weekends. There were no boats today. No children. Just the ripple of water and wind through the trees. I sat on a bench. The wood was cold beneath me, but I didn't move. I watched the water. Thought about how something can seem still, even when it's constantly shifting beneath the surface. That's what I felt like, still on the outside, turbulent underneath. And the worst part was, I didn't know how deep it went. When I came home, the house was just as I'd left it. I stood in the hallway, keys still in hand, and stared at the photograph on the wall, me and my husband, taken years ago on a vacation. We were younger, smiling, arms around each other. I tried to remember how that moment felt. Not just what it looked like. But I couldn't. The feeling was gone. Not erased, but distant. Faded like the photograph itself. That night, I went to bed early. Alone. The sheets were too cold, the room too quiet. I thought about him again, not in the way people romanticize forbidden things, but in the way you think about a door you opened and can't close. A door that leads somewhere uncertain. I stared at the ceiling for a long time. And when I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything left unsaid. The morning started with the sound of birds tapping against the windowpane. Not singing, tapping. Light, persistent, almost annoyed. I sat up slowly, my back aching the way it often did lately, and looked around the room that had grown too familiar. It was my husband's third day away, and I had officially stopped pretending to fill the hours with meaning. I wasn't lonely in the usual sense. I was full of something else now, quiet tension, a kind of electricity that hadn't quite found its circuit. I moved through the kitchen like a ghost. Made toast, buttered it, let it go cold. Poured coffee, didn't drink it. I glanced at the table, half expecting another message that wouldn't come. He hadn't written. Not since that night in the backyard. But silence could carry weight too, and I felt it heavy across my chest. By noon, I was pacing. The house was too clean. My hands had no tasks left. I wiped down the same countertop 3 times and still felt no relief. I picked up a book, read the same sentence over and over, then dropped it face down. I stood at the window, looking out at the street like I might see something that would offer me a reason to move. Nothing did. So I did the one thing I hadn't done in a long time, I called someone. My neighbor, an older woman who lived alone and spent most of her days pruning her roses. I offered to drive her to the pharmacy, something I knew she didn't need but might accept anyway. She did. Small talk filled the air between us, and for an hour, I felt normal. Like someone else. Someone uncomplicated. After I dropped her off, I didn't go home right away. I drove aimlessly through neighborhoods I didn't recognize, through back roads framed by trees, through old industrial zones that had been left behind. And then, without truly intending to, I found myself in front of a small art gallery, one I had passed before but never entered. I parked. Inside, it was nearly empty. The woman behind the desk looked up and nodded but didn't speak. The walls were covered in pieces that didn't match, abstracts next to portraits, metalwork beside delicate watercolor. I wandered slowly, stopping in front of a painting of a woman on a staircase. Her face was blurred, her body caught mid-step, like she didn't know whether she was ascending or descending. I stared at it for a long time. By the time I returned home, the sun had already started to drop. The house welcomed me with the same silence it always did, but something was different. The air felt warmer. Lived in. Familiar. And then I saw it, his car in the driveway. He hadn't texted. He hadn't called. But he was there. I don't know what moved my body forward. I don't remember how I unlocked the door, stepped inside, or found him in the kitchen, as if he belonged there. He was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, looking out the window toward the backyard. He turned slowly when he heard me. I didn't speak. Neither did he. The moment wasn't cinematic. There were no swelling violins, no grand confessions. Just quiet. Stillness. And something trembling just beneath it. I walked past him and placed my bag on the table. I took off my coat, hung it on the chair. I poured a glass of water. All of it slow. Measured. Then I turned to him and looked. Really looked. His face was tired, his eyes steady. I could see the same conflict there that I carried in my chest. We didn't say what we were both thinking. We didn't ask for permission. We didn't negotiate our way into that moment. We simply stood, and eventually, we moved. We kissed. No hesitation. No panic. No need to explain. We kissed. And then we pulled away. Slowly. Carefully. Like we'd just opened something we weren't sure how to close. I don't remember who stepped back first. I only remember the way the room felt afterward, denser, like the very air knew something had shifted. He said he should go. I nodded. He didn't move. I whispered, "Do you want to stay?" He looked at me, but didn't answer right away. He was weighing something, measuring the cost of this moment against everything that came before it. "I want to," he said finally. That wasn't an answer. Not really. But it was honest. I stepped closer, not touching him, just standing near. We stayed like that for what felt like forever. Then I stepped away again, as if distance might somehow give me clarity. It didn't. He left. Not abruptly, not with regret. He left like someone who didn't want to go but knew he had to. After the door closed, I stood there. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I simply stood in my kitchen, in my quiet house, in my complicated skin, and I knew something irreversible had taken place. It wasn't just about desire. It wasn't even about loneliness. It was about being seen. Being held, even briefly, in someone's awareness, fully and without expectation. I went to bed that night without brushing my teeth. Without folding the blanket on the couch. Without tidying anything. I lay in the dark with my thoughts spinning like a carousel, faces and words and moments blurring into each other. And in the center of it all was that kiss. That simple, quiet kiss. The one that didn't ask for anything. The one that answered a question I hadn't known I was asking. The one I would remember long after everything else had faded. The suitcase returned to the hallway the same way it had left, quietly, without ceremony. My husband stepped inside with that familiar half-sigh he always released after a long trip, one that signaled both relief and fatigue. He greeted me casually, told me the meetings had gone well, and asked if we had any coffee left. I smiled, nodded, and moved to the kitchen, measuring out the grounds with a hand steadier than I expected. From the outside, it must have looked seamless, just another homecoming, just another domestic rhythm resuming where it had paused. But nothing about it felt the same. I watched him settle back into the house over the next hour. He unpacked mechanically, tossing socks into the laundry basket, plugging his phone in, checking messages. I answered his questions the way I always had, easily, predictably. He didn't notice anything unusual in my voice. Or maybe he did and chose not to ask. I couldn't decide which would have hurt more. When he asked how things had been while he was gone, I told him the truth, at least the version of it he expected. I said the weather had been nice. I said I had kept busy. I said the neighbors were replanting their hedges again, and that the dog 2 doors down still barked at nothing after dark. I didn't tell him I had kissed his father. Twice. I didn't tell him that I'd started walking differently, slower, as if expecting something at every corner. I didn't tell him that I now understood what it meant to feel both terrified and alive at once. That night, he suggested we go out for dinner. I agreed. We went to the same Italian restaurant we always did when we were trying to reconnect without talking about why we needed to. The server remembered our order. The music was soft, the lights dim. He talked about work. I listened. I nodded. My fork moved across the plate in the right directions. My laugh came on time. I wasn't lying. I was performing. And I was good at it. Back at home, he poured himself a drink and offered me one. I declined. My stomach already felt heavy. He stretched out on the couch and turned on a documentary. I sat beside him, legs tucked under me, watching the screen without seeing anything. At some point, he reached for my hand and held it, absent-mindedly rubbing his thumb across my knuckles. That gesture used to make me melt. That night, it felt like muscle memory. He asked if I was tired. I said yes. We went to bed. He fell asleep quickly. I didn't. I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint cracks in the paint with my eyes. I wondered what would happen if I told him the truth. I wondered if I'd survive the echo of that conversation. I wondered what part of me had changed so quietly and so completely that I could lie this convincingly. In the morning, life continued. He went to the gym, then to the office. I stayed behind, folding laundry, straightening cushions, watering the plants. Every sound in the house felt louder than it should have been: the click of the washing machine door, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant knock of a woodpecker outside the kitchen window. I kept moving through them all like I had somewhere to be. But I didn't. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. My body stiffened before I even reached the door. When I opened it, it wasn't him. It was a delivery, a small box addressed to me, no return label. I signed for it without thinking and carried it inside, heart thudding harder than necessary. I opened it at the kitchen counter. Inside was a book, an old edition of a poetry collection I'd once mentioned in passing during one of those quiet conversations. There was no note. Just the book. And inside it, a dried leaf tucked between pages. I recognized the poem immediately. It was about restraint. About holding back what the heart wants most. I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe deeply. I just stood there, one hand on the counter, the other holding the book, and let the silence wash over me. I knew he had sent it. There was no one else who could have. And I understood exactly what it meant. This wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a message asking for more. It was a gesture. A confirmation that something real had passed between us, and that neither of us was pretending it hadn't. I placed the book on the shelf behind the dining table, hidden between two cookbooks. I didn't want to see it every day. But I didn't want to forget where it was. That evening, my husband came home early. He brought takeout and 2 movies he thought I might like. He was trying. I saw it. Felt it. And I appreciated it more than I let on. We ate on the couch, legs tangled loosely, the TV filling the room with laughter that neither of us echoed. We were comfortable. We were familiar. But comfort wasn't the same as closeness. After dinner, he suggested we go for a walk. We used to do that often. It was his way of resetting, of saying, "Let's try again," without using words. I agreed. We walked slowly down our street, then turned onto the trail behind the park. The sky was dimming. Street lights flickered on. We passed a couple walking a small dog, and I smiled at them automatically. He talked about a possible vacation. Just the 2 of us. Somewhere quiet, maybe coastal. He asked what I thought. I said it sounded nice. And it did. It really did. But inside, I felt something folding in on itself. Like I was agreeing to something I couldn't fully inhabit. When we returned home, he kissed me on the cheek before heading to shower. I stayed in the living room, lights low, fingers tracing the stitching on the throw pillow. My mind drifted again, to the book, the leaf, the silence. I wondered if he was doing the same somewhere else. If he sat with the same questions. Later that night, I dreamed of standing on a platform, watching a train pass without getting on. I wasn't late. I wasn't lost. I just stood there, watching something I almost chose disappear into the distance. I woke with that image still in my chest. and I realized I hadn't missed the train. I had let it go. And now I had to live with what stayed behind. The day he called, it was raining. Not a storm, not the heavy kind that lashes at windows or floods streets. It was soft, persistent and quiet. The kind of rain that makes you stay still, wrap yourself in a blanket, and think about all the things you haven't said out loud. I was standing by the window, coffee in hand, watching the water gather along the edge of the porch when the phone rang. His name on the screen sent something through me, low and hot, like panic, but not quite. I didn't answer immediately. I let it ring twice, 3 times. Then I pressed the green circle and held the phone to my ear, saying nothing. He didn't say my name. He just said, "Can we talk?" That was all. I didn't ask what it was about. I didn't pretend I didn't know. I just replied, "When?" "Now, if that's all right." I checked the clock. My husband was at work. He wouldn't be back until evening. I had hours, technically. But time wasn't the issue. The issue was everything else. Still, I said, "Okay." I didn't change clothes. I didn't fix my hair. I didn't put on perfume or makeup. I slipped on shoes, grabbed my keys, and drove. The rain followed me the entire way, brushing against the windshield in soft waves. I turned off the radio halfway through the drive and let the silence settle in around me. When I pulled up to his house, the porch light was already on. It was late afternoon, but the clouds made it feel like twilight. I parked, got out, and stood at the edge of his driveway for a second too long. My hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something else I didn't want to name. He opened the door before I knocked. For a moment, neither of us moved. We just looked at each other, 2 people suspended in the quiet between decisions. Then he stepped aside, and I walked in. His home smelled of something warm. Wood, perhaps. Paper. Familiar things. Nothing romantic, nothing artificial. Just life. There were books on the coffee table, a mug half full beside the armchair. It wasn't staged. He hadn't tried to impress me. I stood in the center of the room, unsure of what to do with my hands. He motioned toward the couch. I sat. He didn't sit next to me. He sat across, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "I've been thinking," he said, finally. "About all of this." I nodded. Words didn't come easily. Not yet. He looked tired. Not physically, but emotionally. Like someone who had carried a thought too long. He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit I'd seen before. "I know this can't continue," he said. "It shouldn't have started." The sentence hung between us. I could have agreed. I should have. But instead, I just said, "Then why did it?" He looked up. His eyes were clear, not defensive. Just honest. "Because I felt something I hadn't felt in years," he said quietly. "Because when I looked at you, I didn't see someone else's wife. I saw someone I wanted to listen to. Someone who looked back at me like I wasn't fading." My throat tightened. I wasn't ready for that kind of truth. Not spoken out loud. I leaned back slightly. The couch creaked beneath me. My fingers found the seam of the cushion and traced it mindlessly. "I didn't plan any of it," I whispered. "I wasn't searching for anything." "I know," he said. "That's what makes it harder." We fell silent again. The rain had grown heavier, tapping now, almost impatient. I could feel it through the walls, through my skin. Every drop a tiny question I didn't know how to answer. After a while, I stood up. I moved to the window and watched the water run down the glass. My reflection was faint, blurred, almost unrecognizable. I didn't feel like myself anymore. Or maybe I was finally seeing myself for the first time. He didn't follow me. He stayed seated, giving me space. I don't want to destroy anything, I said, still facing the window. I don't think you have, he replied. But I've opened something, I said. And I don't know how to close it. I heard him shift. A breath, maybe. Then footsteps. He came to stand beside me, not too close, just enough. We didn't touch. We didn't need to. His voice was soft. I think some things aren't meant to be closed. Just understood. I turned then. Slowly. Looked up at him. His eyes weren't pleading. They weren't demanding anything. There was only acceptance there. And something quieter. Something like grief. I reached up and touched his arm. Lightly. Just my fingertips. He didn't move away. And then, without words, without plans or promises, we crossed the line again. We spent the night together. It wasn't an escape. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even passion in the traditional sense. It was something else entirely. Something rooted in the ache of being seen and still chosen. In the quiet collapse of two lives that had outgrown their cages. In the morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was still gray, but softer, like it had exhaled. I woke before he did. I sat in a chair by the window, knees pulled up, watching the world turn slowly back into itself. I didn't feel guilt, exactly. What I felt was closer to stillness. To sadness. To the weight of knowing that what had happened couldn't be undone, and yet, somehow, had always felt inevitable. When he woke, he didn't speak. He just looked at me, and I looked back. Nothing dramatic. Nothing romantic. Just real. I dressed without ceremony. I didn't linger. As I reached for the doorknob, he said my name. I paused. He didn't finish the sentence. I didn't ask him to. I drove home through the wet streets, the tires sending up arcs of water behind me. I didn't play music. I didn't rehearse excuses. I just drove. When I reached our house, it was still. My husband hadn't returned yet. The lights were off. The air was dry. I stood in the entryway for a long time, keys in hand, unsure of what to do next. I wasn't the same person who had left. I couldn't be. And now, all that remained was the silence I'd returned to. But this time, it would have a name. And I would carry it. Alone. The house was cold when I returned. I stepped through the door with a kind of deliberate slowness, half expecting the walls to look different, to carry the weight of what had happened. But they didn't. The air was still, the floor untouched. No signs of disruption. Just my shoes in the corner where I had left them the day before, my sweater draped over the armrest of the couch, and a vase of tulips slightly wilted on the dining table. Everything was exactly as I'd left it, and yet, I had the distinct sense that nothing would ever be the same again. I placed my bag down carefully, as though the sound might break the silence. My body felt heavy, not from exhaustion, but from something more internal, like I was carrying too many things in places I couldn't name. My clothes clung to my skin, wrinkled and stale, but I didn't move to change. I walked to the kitchen and turned on the kettle, then leaned against the counter, staring at the floor while the water slowly came to life with a low hum. He hadn't texted. He hadn't called. I hadn't either. There was nothing more to say, not because there wasn't more we felt, but because words were insufficient. We had crossed the boundary and then sat in the echo of it. Not out of passion, not out of rebellion, but because something inside both of us had asked not to be invisible anymore. And now, I was standing in my own kitchen with no plan and no script, trying to understand what came next. The kettle clicked. I poured the water and made tea I didn't want. I sat at the table and wrapped my fingers around the mug for warmth. Outside, the sky was a dull white, cloud-thick and indifferent. It mirrored how I felt, neutral on the surface, chaotic underneath. My husband returned that evening. His voice was cheerful. He tossed his keys into the bowl by the door and told me the client dinner went longer than expected. He talked about the food, the traffic, a funny story someone had told. I listened, nodded in the right places, and smiled once or twice. I was convincing. Too convincing. He didn't notice the distance in my eyes, or the way my body had folded in slightly, protectively. We ate dinner in the living room. Take out. He chose a movie. I watched the screen, but I couldn't follow the plot. My mind was elsewhere, fragmented, drifting. He leaned against me at one point, his arm resting along the back of the couch. It felt foreign, like a memory from a life that belonged to someone else. I didn't pull away. But I didn't lean in either. That night, I lay awake again. He fell asleep quickly, as he always did. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway. I stared at the ceiling, tracing invisible shapes, listening to his breathing. I turned onto my side and looked at his face, half-lit, relaxed in sleep. There was no anger in me. No hatred. No sharp edge. Only a dull ache of distance, of two lives running parallel but never intersecting. In the morning, I woke early. I moved quietly through the house, drinking coffee while the sun rose behind the blinds. I opened a window to let in the cool air. It smelled like soil and dew. I stood there, letting the breeze wrap around me. It felt cleaner than the thoughts in my head. By mid-morning, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in our bedroom. Not examining my reflection, not criticizing it. Just observing. My eyes looked darker. Not tired, just deeper, as though something had shifted inside. I ran my fingers along my jawline, down my neck, over the collar of my shirt. My body was still mine, but it no longer felt like it belonged to the version of me who had lived in this house all these years. She was still here, but she had split. Fractured into a woman who had made a choice, and a woman who now had to live with it. I got dressed slowly. Nothing elaborate, just jeans, a soft blouse, a coat. I needed to get out. I didn't know where I was going, but the walls were beginning to close in, heavy with the weight of secrets. I told my husband I had errands. He nodded, kissed my cheek, and went back to his laptop. I watched him for a second longer than necessary. He didn't look up. I drove for a while without direction. I passed the bookstore, the bakery, the park. None of them called to me. Eventually, I stopped at a small cafe on the edge of town, one I hadn't visited in years. I ordered tea and sat at a table by the window. The space was half empty, quiet. People spoke in hushed tones. A young couple shared a pastry, heads bent close. A woman read alone, turning pages like it was a sacred act. I sipped slowly, watching the world move gently past the glass. I wondered how many people around me were living lives held together by silence. How many carried something like this, a truth they didn't speak, a longing they didn't act on, or did, and then buried it beneath routine. I didn't stay long. I couldn't. The quiet started to feel too familiar, too reflective. I left a tip, nodded at the server, and walked out into the pale sunlight. At home, the day passed in fragments. I cooked dinner out of habit. My husband talked about an upcoming trip. He asked if I wanted to come this time, make it a getaway. I smiled, told him I'd think about it. He seemed pleased. Hopeful, even. He reached across the table and touched my hand. I didn't flinch. I didn't retreat. But I didn't close my fingers around his either. We stayed like that for a moment, his hand resting over mine, my hand unmoving. After dinner, he took a call in the other room. I stayed in the kitchen and stared at the leftovers, unsure of whether to save them or throw them away. I chose to save them. I packed the containers carefully and stacked them in the fridge. That night, I stood by the window in the dark, watching the moon rise. I thought about calling him, not my husband, but the other him. Just to hear his voice. Just to know what silence sounded like on the other end. But I didn't. I placed the phone down and folded my arms around myself. I don't know what I'm doing anymore, not really. I wake up, I move, I speak, I function. But there's a layer underneath it all now, a thin film of knowing. Knowing what I felt, what I did, what it means. And what it doesn't. Tomorrow, I'll wake up again. I'll wash my face, drink my coffee, answer questions with a smile. I will exist in this life I've built, wearing it like a coat that no longer fits. Too snug in some places, too loose in others. But for now, I'll just stand here. Still. Quiet. A woman with a secret tucked between her ribs, pulsing like a second heartbeat. The week passed without disruption. My husband's days returned to their usual cadence, mornings with coffee and silence, evenings with news and brief conversation. He talked about his projects, offered to book a reservation for a new restaurant, mentioned a show he thought we could watch together. On the surface, everything was functioning. On the inside, I had gone quiet. I stopped asking myself what the right thing to do was. That question had exhausted itself into meaninglessness. What I felt now wasn't confusion. It was clarity. Painful, yes. Complicated. But clear in the way that only truth can be, even when it's unwanted. One morning, I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing out a mug, when I heard my phone vibrate from the dining table. A message. My hands froze under the tap. I knew before I looked who it was. I dried my fingers and picked up the phone. It wasn't long. Just a line. I'll be near your neighborhood this afternoon. No expectations. Just wanted you to know. I stared at the words for a long time before putting the phone face down. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. He knew I'd read it. And I knew I wouldn't look away if he came. The hours moved slowly. I folded laundry that didn't need folding. I cleaned surfaces that weren't dirty. I avoided the clock but kept checking the light outside the window, watching it shift toward late afternoon. Then, just past 4, the doorbell rang. My breath caught in my throat. Not out of fear, not guilt, but anticipation laced with something like mourning. I didn't rush. I walked to the door with measured steps. When I opened it, he stood there. Just as he always did, calm, unassuming, hands in his coat pockets, as if he wasn't carrying something heavy between his ribs. We didn't speak. Not at first. I stepped back, and he walked in. He didn't sit. Neither did I. We stood in the middle of the living room like people waiting for a verdict neither wanted to deliver. I won't stay long, he said. I nodded. I still hadn't looked him in the eye. He took a step closer, then paused. I don't know what I expected this to be. My throat felt tight. Me neither. We stood there, two adults in the center of a room filled with memories not shared between us, but echoing around us anyway. He glanced at the bookshelf. The book, was it too much? I shook my head. It was, kind. Silence again. Not heavy this time. Just present. I've thought about that night, he said softly. Not just the act. The hours after. The quiet. You sitting by the window. I remembered it, too. Not in snapshots, but as a continuous feeling, weightless and wakeful at once. Stillness like I had never known it. I'm not here to pull you anywhere, he added. I just didn't want it to end in silence. I looked at him then. His eyes were tired but clear. He hadn't come with demands. He hadn't come to beg for anything. He had come to place something gently in front of me, closure, or maybe permission, to let go, or not. I don't know what to do with what I feel, I said. Neither do I. He moved toward the door. He meant it, he wasn't staying. He wasn't pushing. I walked him there, and for a moment, we stood in the open space between departure and decision. He reached for the doorknob, then paused. You were never invisible, he said. Not to me. I wanted to answer. I wanted to say something that would honor the enormity of what we'd shared without unmaking the life I still lived. But words were brittle. All I could do was nod. He opened the door. Light from the overcast sky poured in. He stepped outside. I didn't follow. When the door closed, the silence that followed was different. It didn't press against me, it settled into me, like something I had finally agreed to carry. I spent the next few hours moving slowly through the house. I made tea. I lit a candle I hadn't used in months. I sat on the floor and flipped through an old photo album. Not to feel nostalgic, but to remind myself that memory is not always an anchor, it can also be a mirror. There were pictures of me and my husband in our early years. Trips. Celebrations. Quiet mornings captured in bad lighting. I looked at my face in those images. I tried to find the version of me that lived behind the smile. Later that evening, I started writing. Not a letter. Not a journal. Just words. Sentences that arrived without structure, like they had been waiting for me to finally release them. I didn't write about him. I wrote about myself. About the way I'd felt in moments I hadn't admitted to anyone. About the silence between two people that deepens not from anger but from absence. I wrote about loneliness in a full house. About being touched without being seen. About wanting to feel undeniable, even for a moment. It was not a confession. It was not a justification. It was simply the truth. When my husband came home, I closed the notebook and tucked it beneath a stack of papers. He kissed my cheek, told me he'd picked up dinner. I thanked him. We sat and ate together. We talked about a neighbor's new car, a leak in the upstairs bathroom, a movie coming out next week. And somewhere in the middle of it, I realized I didn't feel like I was lying. Not exactly. I was just speaking from a part of myself he still knew, the part that was still his. The other part, the one that had unfolded in a single night and echoed in a stranger's voice, was mine now. That night, before bed, I stood in the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. I didn't look older. I didn't look newer. I just looked awake. Fully. I turned off the light, crawled into bed, and lay beside the man I'd built a life with. And I knew I would carry both truths. Not to compare. Not to decide. But to understand what it meant to be whole, even in fragments.